Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last of our three History of Antarctica lectures, as well as the final lecture that will contain new material that you will be tested on. And this lecture doesn't cover quite as much ground chronologically as does lecture 13, which was the pre-heroic age history lecture, but we're still going to go pretty quickly. We're going to breeze by the World Wars to the International Geophysical Year and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty. And part of this relates to the fact that the World Wars really limited the resources and the interest in Antarctic exploration. None of the world wars were fought in Antarctica, which is a good thing. But we'll see that there were some interesting geopolitical incidents related to the world wars that would provide some motivation for countries to establish a system for governing Antarctica. We'll talk a bit about that system, the Antarctic Treaty System, and then the second half of this lecture will be an overview of conservation and economic activities in Antarctica in the modern age, as well as some recent geopolitical conflicts that have underscored the need for the Antarctic Treaty. Consider, meanwhile, what we learned last week about climate change in Antarctica and how that fits into all of this, particularly factors like extraction of fossil fuels. We're rapidly getting near the end of the quarter, and including this week, we have 2 remaining weeks and then finals week. So again, this is the last lecture of new material. And I want to remind you all that there is a lab due on Friday, May 28th, which is the final lab of the quarter. And that is the Climate Change and Paleoclimatology lab. Meanwhile, reading assignment number 2 is due just 2 days after that on Sunday, May 30th. And I wanted to also remind you that if you wanted to submit assignments for extra credit, please submit them before Sunday, June 6th at 11:59 p.m. That is the Sunday before finals week. So on Wednesday, May 26th, I'll be holding office hours from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock p.m. and recording lecture 18, which will be a review of the pre-midterm material that might be likely to show up on the final, and especially how it might connect to post-midterm material. There is not going to be a lecture coming out on May 31st because it's Memorial Day. And the last lecture will be recorded live during office hours on Wednesday, June 2nd at 2 o'clock p.m. That will be lecture 19, and that will be a review of the material that has come out after the midterm, with a heavy focus on lectures 15 through 17. And the final itself will open on Monday, June 7th, which is the Monday of finals week, and it will close at 11:59 p.m. on that Friday, June 11th. I will be releasing a study guide before then, and I will also be having another practice quiz like I had available for the midterm that will be available for you to test yourself on during Dead Week. And I briefly wanted to mention Lab 8, which draws heavily from last week's lectures on climate change. And those are lectures 15 and 16. Lecture 15 covers the science. Lecture 15 covers the science and principles of anthropogenic climate change more broadly. Lecture 16 talks about methods used to study paleoclimatology, as well as the particular effects of climate change in Antarctica. And here's some terms that are going to show up in the lab that you want to be familiar with, like what is an ice core and how does it have to do with paleoclimatology? What does it mean for glaciation to be occurring versus deglaciation? What do we mean by correlation? How do concentrations of carbon dioxide, for example, align with benthic oxygen isotopes taken from carbonate? And then remember that ppm refers to parts per million, and because we're talking about greenhouse gases, which are overall a very small percentage, well, a very small portion of Earth's atmosphere, we use parts per million to talk about them while using fewer decimal points. And I want to mention that with this graph, which does show up in the lab, it has some questions based on it. You'll want to notice that there are some labels on the left and some on the right. And you want to be careful about which label goes with which. For example, the Antarctic temperature label, the Antarctic temperature trend line is labeled on the right, and that refers to this purple trend, whereas the benthic oxygen 18 is labeled on the left, and that refers to the green trend immediately below it. So you'll see the label is over here, and it's centered about this green trend here. Again, if you don't see a label on this side, check on the other side. They alternated them to make it a bit less crowded in terms of text. Again, the TAs are available this week for office hours, so take advantage of that. So today's class is mostly about the modern history of Antarctica. The heroic age ends with the First World War, and then there's relatively little in terms of Antarctic exploration until after the Second World War. But countries did begin to lay claims on Antarctica, and many of these countries had sent explorers during the heroic age. And a number of military operations and attempts to start bases, some of which were more serious than others, occurred early on. And this underscored the need for a system to outline what was going to be done with Antarctica and how people would interact with it. And we'll talk about a period of renewed focus in scientific research in Antarctica during a thaw in the Cold War between um, the United States and its Western European allies, and then the communist countries fronted by the Soviet Union. A thaw during that sort of proxy war enabled an intense period of research in Antarctica that became known as the International Geophysical Year, and that preceded the signing of the Antarctic Treaty. And Lecture 17b gives a short summary of conservation, economic activity, and some recent geopolitical conflicts in Antarctica. The heroic age had opened a lot more of Antarctica. Over the course of about 20 years, we went from really very few people having ever even landed on Antarctica to people having reached the South Pole, and most of the continent being mapped. During the heroic age, many of the explorers would, at some point during their trip, plant a flag of their country and claim whatever newly explored lands there were in the name of their governing empire. This was, of course, really difficult to enforce, and it also wasn't clear what legal basis anybody had for claiming territory. And in general, it's sort of like what really enables one to claim territory as their own, whether we're talking about a person or an empire. So Antarctica was kind of an open question in that regard. The British Empire began by claiming a number of the subantarctic islands, like the Falkland Islands, which they established as the Falkland Islands Dependency in 1908. And to this day, the Falklands support a population of a few thousand British citizens. Meanwhile, the UK formally claimed South Georgia, the site of many former whaling stations, including where Shackleton had eventually ended up, as well as the South Sandwich Islands. And that is now also, the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands are also their own territory now. You can see there's a seal and a penguin on the flag, in fact, a macaroni penguin. There's no permanent population there anymore, though, because the whaling stations are all shut down. They also claimed the South Shetlands and the South Orkneys, among which is Deception Island, which we've spoken about a couple of times. The UK began to attempt to enforce license fees for whaling and sealing, but this didn't really end up helping them much because the seal population had really badly plummeted from overhunting, and baleen whales had become scarce as well. Not to mention, people just didn't need whale oil anymore. Electricity was more commonplace, and this has let whale populations somewhat recover in peace. So, in terms of the Antarctic continent itself, various governments began to claim portions of Antarctica in the hopes that down the line they might be able to secure mineral rights and the ability to build military bases. The coast was mapped much more extensively than the interior, so these claims were often defined as sectors of longitude, extending out from the South Pole. And notice that the claims are sort of cone-shaped because the lines of longitude converge towards the pole. That's why it kind of looks like they're straight out like this. And remember that we learned that in geography. Now, Great Britain, which had claimed a small part of the peninsula along with the subantarctic islands in 1908, revised their claim in 1917 to be an entire sliver of Antarctica, defined as the area between 20 degrees and 80 degrees west, occupying the area around the peninsula. New Zealand, meanwhile, officially claimed what is now known as the Ross Dependency, and that is actually physically where McMurdo Base is, in 1923, and France claimed what they referred to as Adélie Land in 1924. Australia also claimed all of the land between 160 and 45 degrees east in 1933. They were forced to exclude France's claim to Adélie Land, however, and that's why Australia's claim is split in two on this map. Norway claimed what is known as Dronning Maud, or Queen Maud land, but apparently didn't clearly define it as a sliver of longitude because they didn't really clearly claim the area that is near the South Pole itself. And there is a small sliver over here that has never been claimed. It is one of the very few places on Earth that is actually not claimed at all by any nation. So this is all kind of just imaginary lines, because for one thing, nobody lives here, and for another thing, this was very hard to enforce. And during the World Wars, especially during the Second World War, nobody really had the resources to try to establish a firm claim over Antarctica. Now, by 1939, all but 80 degrees to 150 degrees west were claimed. And both the United States and the Soviet Union did something that I find kind of amusing, and they decided both of them claimed the entire continent separately. None of the other European governments really took this seriously, and the US eventually sort of backed down on this. Meanwhile, some South American countries, fearing that they might lose access to resources, began to make their own claims. In 1940, Chile claimed a sliver that actually overlaps with the British claim, and Argentina subsequently claimed a sliver that overlapped with both that of Chile and the UK. And notice the timing. This was all going on during the Second World War. Antarctica was quite removed from the fighting itself, from the fronts of the Pacific Ocean and Europe, but a lot of the parties directly involved in the Second World War had claims in Antarctica, and there were a number of small-scale military operations and attempts to build bases during this time. One of these was an early attempt by US citizens to build a base. The first United States base was known as Little America, and it was established by Richard Byrd, who was an adventurer who had also explored the Arctic, and he had claimed that he had been the first person to fly a plane to the North Pole. That claim has since come under a lot of scrutiny, and it's seen as being unlikely to be true at this point. He did fly in Antarctica as well, interestingly enough, and he took 2 ships as well as 3 airplanes to Antarctica and built a base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf, so actually out on the extension of the glacier itself, not on solid land. And he named it Little America. He and his crew spent the first summer undertaking geologic surveys and taking photos, and then Byrd himself flew to the South Pole in November 1929 during their second summer. He had actually had to throw emergency supplies out the window so that the plane could get enough lift to overcome the height of the polar plateau, aka the very high East Antarctic ice sheet. Byrd would later return to Antarctica for a second expedition in 1934, and he operated a weather station completely by himself for 5 months. He ended up having to be rescued, actually. Little America no longer exists. It's not a site that can be visited because the base collapsed. The ice shelves are relatively stable, but they move. They move a lot, and that sort of ruined the base over time. And the United States government would use the approximate location of Little America for a number of subsequent camps. As late as the 1950s, the government also began looking for a location for a more stable base, and the focus shifted to picking a spot on land for that. Now, the United Kingdom, meanwhile, built the first permanent bases in Antarctica in the 1940s, and the Second World War was well underway by the early 1940s. The United Kingdom was at war with Japan by this point, along with the United States. And remember that Japan had visited Antarctica and made a half-serious territorial claim before. Germany, which by this point was under control of the Nazi Party, had also launched several expeditions, and Germany in the 1930s had actually sent another expedition to Antarctica, and Nazi Germany had claimed part of Antarctica as a land that they called New Swabia. This was after Germany had had all of its overseas territories transferred to other countries as part of the reparations for the First World War. So it was seen, so it's not talked about as often as, say, them invading Czechoslovakia or annexing Austria, because going to Antarctica didn't really involve subjugating other people. But Nazi Germany did make another expedition to Antarctica, and they claimed a part of it as New Swabia. So this was kind of a cause for alarm for many others. And so the British sent a small force to the peninsula and sent a lot more troops to the Falkland Islands. Germany is quite physically far from Antarctica and really didn't do a whole lot in Antarctica after that initial expedition. There's a conspiracy theory that Hitler had a base in Antarctica. There is no basis in fact for that. However, the British managed to piss off the Argentines in the meantime because Argentina had claimed the Falkland Islands and the peninsula also. And the British removed a bunch of Argentine flags from the Falklands and other subantarctic islands and the peninsula in the process of expanding their military presence. And Argentina was nominally neutral during the Second World War, but it had close ties with Italy and Germany, and the UK was afraid that Argentina would collaborate with Germany and Japan to seize the subantarctic islands and possibly cause strategic military problems for the UK. Regardless of whether that really would have happened, the Argentinian government was not exactly thrilled about the fact that the UK was just kind of willy-nilly throwing their flags away. And Argentina has always claimed the Falkland Islands, and they would eventually go to war over the islands in the 1980s, as I'll talk about a bit during the second half of the lecture. Meanwhile, the United States came out of the Second World War relatively unscathed, in part because very little of the fighting took place on US soil, outside of Pearl Harbor and some skirmishes on the Hawaiian Islands. We don't really touch on World War II much because not much of the fighting took place in Antarctica, but it was quite devastating to the vast majority of the countries that fought in it. You have to consider, for one thing, that the Holocaust occurred during it and wiped out the vast majority of the Jewish population in Europe, horrifyingly. The United States didn't see much of the war fought on its own soil, and so it exited the war somewhat strengthened in terms of its world power, and it would emerge as one of the two superpowers that would grapple over geopolitical influence in the coming years, during what is known now as the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The United States was economically booming and also now had an expanded military in the aftermath of the Second World War, and it was in a strong position to establish a presence in Antarctica, and a more permanent, more serious, long-term presence than had been set up by Richard Byrd in Little America. So in 1946, the US Navy operated an expedition with the name Operation High Jump, and it was publicly chartered for exploration and for aerial mapping. And it would indeed accomplish this purpose. Out of Operation High Jump came over 70,000 aerial pictures of the coast and of the dry valleys, and these provided one of the first systematic data sets from the continent that covered a large area. And in fact, my advisor and I used some of these aerial images while studying up on field locations before we went to Antarctica. But the bottom line is that it was a front for a military mission in the days when those activities were not explicitly banned under the Antarctic Treaty, but still when it was sort of controversial as to whether people should be building bases or fighting or conducting military training in Antarctica. There's a good chance that what they were doing mainly was scouting for base locations, and most experts think that the goal of this operation was to make a training base in order to help the United States prepare for a possible war with the Soviet Union. A possible war with the Soviet Union involved fighting in the Arctic potentially, as well as the possibility that American soldiers would have to fight in the cold tundra of Siberia, and also the possibility of fighting Russia in the winter in general. Because one thing that I really distinctly remember from European history is that both Napoleon and Hitler were foiled to a big extent by the fact that they tried to invade Russia, especially during the winter, and they struggled to fight against the Russian defense in a climate that the Russians could handle, but that they were not super used to. So basically having to fight Russia, especially on their own turf, scared the United States, and the Antarctic bases were quite potentially being conceived as a place where American soldiers could train for this. And a full-scale war never actually broke out directly between the US and the Soviet Union, either in the Arctic, the Antarctic, or elsewhere, but tensions remained high, and you had proxy wars like those in Korea, in Vietnam, and Afghanistan that went on throughout the Cold War. Not to mention, both sides had nuclear weapons, and after the devastation wrought at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a lot of fear about nuclear weapons, including concerns about where they would be tested. And this was one concern that would feed into the establishment of the Antarctic Treaty. And you can see there's a bit more infrastructure at these bases. You have wooden huts, you have windmills, you have, of course, a flag. Where where High Jump was based is not right at McMurdo itself, and they never did build a permanent training base because they didn't find a good location, and then the treaty would later on ban the establishment of military bases. Now, I hinted to the International Geophysical Year before, and this is a big turning point in Antarctic history. It begins in 1978, or excuse me, 1957, and the reason the International Geophysical Year was called such is because the scientific community worldwide said so, basically. It's kind of like the Pope invoking Jubilee. It's like, we've decided that this is the year of a heavy focus on geology and astrophysics. And this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. For example, 1882 and 1932 had been designated by the European scientific community as International Polar Years. So 1957 wasn't chosen completely arbitrarily, because for one thing, in the mid-1950s, there was something of a thaw and a bit of a mild normalizing relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. If you remember from World War II history, the head of the Soviet Union during the Second World War was Joseph Stalin, who was very effective at fighting against Nazi Germany, but also was a strongman dictator and known for various atrocities. When Stalin died, he was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev, who was not exactly an angel, but was seen as easier to work with than Stalin and a bit less of an ideologue. And so at least for a brief period, there was the possibility that there would be a less negative relationship between the two countries, if not one that was necessarily friendly. So in the 50s, the question of what do we do with Antarctica was still looming. And this was in the wake of the World Wars, of the war with Nazi Germany, of the war in the Pacific, as well as the Holocaust and the dropping of the atomic bombs. And visits to Antarctica had been pretty much unregulated since Antarctica was discovered. And now that Antarctica was better known, there was the issue of countries claiming parts of it and whether that was enforceable or whether that should be done, as well as military bases being built and possibly extraction of minerals and coal that could damage the environment. The growing consensus was that some precedent needed to be established for people to visit Antarctica. And so American and British scientists first proposed that they declare a targeted period of research. And the idea was somewhat radical at the time, that the research should be carried out as an international collaboration rather than as the effort of one country or as separate projects heavily defined by the influence of one country. So 1957 was also, coincidentally, a year in which solar radiation was at its maximum output, based on sunspots and Milankovitch cycles. And this made Antarctica slightly warmer and brighter and also presented some wonderful opportunities for astronomy research. So the International Geophysical Year ended up being 18 months of dedicated funding for Antarctic science. And 67 different scientific organizations from around the world contributed money or participated in some way. And although it was called the International Geophysical Year, and some of the projects were focused on astrophysics that didn't really have to do with Antarctica directly, a lot of the projects, most of them really had an Antarctic focus, and a lot of them were indeed directly related to physics, geology, and astronomy. But the period of 18 months also saw some really interesting biology and climate research going on, along with other topics. And the IGY, more importantly than anything, set the precedent for what we think of when we think of modern Antarctic research and how Antarctica is dealt with today. A lot of bases were built, bases that were intended to be for science. This included the first base at the South Pole, the first iteration of Amundsen Scott South Pole Base, named after the two heads of the two expeditions undertaken during the race to the South Pole. The current structure has been completely rebuilt from this, by the way. During this period, it became very clear that the scientific collaboration was important and was potentially an important foundation for what should be done with Antarctica. The International Council of Scientific Unions, which was a collective assembly for the various scientific organizations, began drafting documents that would formalize how Antarctica would be handled politically, and also what the protocol for conducting scientific research would be. And the Antarctic Treaty came about ultimately as a result of the IGY, as did treaties that regulated whether Antarctica could be used for space launches and a ban on military weapons testing that prevented nations from testing any weapons, whether nuclear or otherwise, in Antarctica. So the treaty itself was signed in 1959 and it went into force in 1961. It expires in 2048, which is within most of our lifetimes, and that's a little bit spooky to think about how that's going to be handled. But the treaty's purpose was to establish that Antarctica would not be a site of international conflict. It codified the protocol for science, and it also was intended to help de-escalate things. As much as the US and the Soviet Union didn't get along, neither of them really wanted to go to war, and neither of them wanted to end up arguing over Antarctica. And the treaty established Antarctica as a bit of a neutral zone that was sort of intended to be removed from the conflicts of the greater world. That's never going to be perfectly possible, of course, but it established that as the goal. And the treaty is quite long and full of legal language, but here's a summary of the key points. It encourages science. It encourages that science occur if it is safe for the people and for Antarctic animals and ecosystems, and if it has a low impact on Antarctic ecosystems. What this means is that the impact of activities that are being undertaken, like building bases or camping out or sampling, those have to be evaluated. And if new activities are proposed, like building an observatory, there has to be an environmental review to determine if these activities will create pollution or harm wildlife or damage ventifacts or other resources. Importantly, it stipulates that countries conducting research must share their results. And this means that, for example, the NSF can't take my research and make that a secret, even if it wanted to. And my research is not really that particularly sensitive or anything, but the treaty says that my research has to be available to people from other countries. It can't be treated as classified information for the United States alone. And this is to enforce the idea that Antarctica is for all countries and that studies done there are for humanity as a whole and not just for one country or for one alliance of nations. It explicitly banned testing of nuclear weapons as well as dumping of radioactive waste, which desperately needed to be put in writing before any countries even considered doing that. Military activities, except for those done only in support of science, were prohibited. So that means no building bases, no doing boot camp, no testing weapons. The Army can be there to do things for the scientists, which I'll talk a little bit about. But other than that, no military activities. The treaty, very importantly, nullified the territorial claims that I mentioned at the start of this lecture. The treaty states that nations that sign the Antarctic Treaty do not recognize each other's claims or enforce their own claims. And it also makes it that the location of a country's base doesn't have to relate to any pre-existing claims. So the United States, outside of sort of not seriously claiming the whole continent, doesn't have a claim in Antarctica, but we have several bases. McMurdo Base, for example, is technically within the Ross Dependency, which is the New Zealand Antarctic claim, but it's a moot point because of the treaty. And finally, in the spirit of international collaboration, the treaty stipulates that all activities that can be inspected and monitored by other nations. And in practice, what's done is that you have joint inspections of bases, such as this joint team of Russian and American inspectors. But the idea is that if you're in Antarctica, you shouldn't have anything to hide. You shouldn't be doing anything that you wouldn't want other countries to see. And there have been some controversies when scientists have been accused of not being open with their results to other countries, because it's like, what are you doing down there? The treaty says, if you're down here, you shouldn't be doing anything that you need to hide from other countries, which is, again, intended to avoid having Antarctica be the provocation for any sort of conflict. There have been a number of amendments added to the Antarctic Treaty in the coming years, because just like any document, as more information comes about, you need to make adjustments. And this has been as new practical needs have become clear. The treaty, as well as these amendments, are known as the Antarctic Treaty System. So in 1964, an amendment called the Agreed Measures for the Conservation of Antarctic Flora and Fauna was drawn up to address conservation of Antarctic biodiversity. A lot of the other amendments have also related to wildlife. For example, in 1972, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Seals was brought about to address the recovery of the seal populations, particularly of Antarctic fur seals that had been devastated by commercial sealing. And this convention completely banned killing Ross seals as well as Antarctic fur seals, and it effectively put an end to sealing in the Antarctic. In 1980, concerns about loss of krill and overfishing led to the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which limited the amount of fishing allowed around Antarctica and set new quotas for different Antarctic fish species, with the possibility that they might be lowered if krill populations continue to drop. Krill populations have indeed declined, and that has caused fish to decline with them, and there's concerns that there has not been a big enough drop in the quota to protect fish populations, and it's become very questionable as to how much fishing commercially should even be allowed in Antarctica at all. One of the biggest changes came in 1998, when it was codified that no new activities could be conducted in the Antarctic unless a full environmental review was done first. This has made science a little more restrictive in Antarctica, out of the concern for not damaging the Antarctic environment with ambitious, untested experiments. The treaty is what regulates Antarctica today, and it's signed by 53 countries out of around 200. Most of these are countries that have bases, but it has also been signed by a few countries that don't have their own bases, but conduct research at other nations' bases. The most recent countries to join all joined in 2015. During that year, Iceland, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, which had actually been part of the Soviet Union and had a role in Antarctic research through that, but as an independent nation, it signed the Antarctic Treaty in 2015. And there's very much the possibility that more countries could join that. But essentially, all countries that do anything in Antarctica have signed the treaty because you have to. This has been something that's been accepted for a while, and my hope is that that continues to be accepted enough that in 2048, signing the treaty again is a non-issue. Fingers crossed. But anyhow, I mentioned before that military activities were banned unless they were directly in support of science, and that was the one exception made. And a lot of this relates to the fact that the United States, when it first began building scientific bases during the International Geophysical Year, they relied very heavily on the Navy, because Navy Seabees, who are the carpenters and builders who work for the Navy, well, they had good know-how in terms of building structures from scratch, especially in remote areas with bad weather conditions, to say the least. So Operation Deep Freeze was the official name for the continuous series of operations by the United States Navy in Antarctica. It began in 1955 in preparation for the IGY, and this actually, interestingly enough, saw Richard Byrd, the guy who had been behind Little America. He actually was appointed the head officer initially. And the operation originally referred only to the preparatory building of the South Pole Station, as well as other support in the years leading up to the IGY. But another Operation Deep Freeze was immediately declared after it was decided to continue to have the Navy running logistics, and it quickly became the norm for the boat and plane operations to be run by the US Navy. This continued until 1998, and in 1998, the Navy officially transferred operations to a joint system in which the US Air Force and the National Guard continue to fly planes to the Antarctic, with operations being run by the National Science Foundation and the United States Antarctic Program in collaboration with private contractors. Lockheed Martin is presently the private contractor for the US Antarctic Program. One other expedition that's worth note was the first successful crossing of the continent on vehicle. This was years after Shackleton and Scott had both unsuccessfully tried to use cars. And this project was a collaboration between several countries during and after the IGY. It was named the Commonwealth TransAntarctic Expedition because, aside from the US, most of the countries had geopolitical connections to the United Kingdom. Sir Edmund Hillary of the UK, who was the first person to summit Mount Everest, and also an Antarctic enthusiast, donated a tractor which was refitted and used as one of the vehicles. He didn't go himself, but he donated a vehicle. And the voyage was a success. It was a very hard trip, though, and nobody made any attempts to cross the continent on vehicle until 1981. And the South Pole was almost entirely accessed by air until very recently. And recently, a project to construct a South Pole Traverse Road began. That was completed in 2007. And it is now possible to drive to the South Pole, but very slowly. It's used to move equipment that's not very temperature sensitive or not super urgent to get there. So that brings us to just about the end of what I'd call the history of Antarctica part. The second half of this lecture will talk more about sort of what modern Antarctica is like. But I did want to talk a little bit about some female Antarctic explorers because the history has been almost entirely male up to this point. Not a good place for me here. I'll just take myself out of the frame. But anyhow, so ship crews were virtually all male throughout the periods of history that I've been addressing, and a woman did not see or land on Antarctica until the 1930s. Ingrid Christensen, who was traveling with her husband, as well as her female companion, Mathilde Weger, they became the first women to sight the mainland in 1931, and Christensen is believed to have been the first woman to set foot in Antarctica. And a lot of the other early women to see Antarctica were those lucky enough to travel along with their husbands as travel to the coastline became more commonplace. In the 20th and 21st century, some institutional barriers have at least officially been removed, and that's meant that more women explorers have gone to Antarctica and partook in Antarctic research. The first woman to reach both poles was Anne Bancroft, who is an American woman, and she, in 1993, led the first all-female expedition to the South Pole. Meanwhile, in 1994, Norwegian Liv Arnesen became the first woman to ski alone to the South Pole, and in 2001, she and Bancroft became the first women to ski across Antarctica. And that was actually one of the first stories I ever heard about Antarctica. In 2001, there was a Time magazine had a kids edition, and there was an article on them in one of those magazines. So they had a feature in one edition, and then several months later, there was a little phew, they made it. That was literally the title of the spot, but it was like there was an article later on saying that yes, they made it, wonderful. So I kind of got to follow along with their expedition years before I went to Antarctica or taught this course. But I would say one of the most impressive explorers to me is Miss Barbara Hillary, who was the first Black woman to reach the North Pole in 2007 at age 75. That wasn't enough for her. She became, at age 79, she became the first known Black woman to reach the South Pole and became the first known Black woman to reach both poles. And this was more than a century after Matthew Henson had become the first man to reach the North Pole. There still have been relatively few women in Antarctic exploration, and especially few women of color, but the work that those who have gone have done is pretty amazing. And I like to highlight Barbara Hillary every time I do this class because it's just really impressive. And getting to the South Pole at age 79 is very impressive. So that concludes the history of Antarctica. We have just one little bit left. I'll talk about some details about modern Antarctica during the second half of the course. Excuse me, second half of the lecture.